I finally have everything I need to do the speed test of these 3 limbs. So I've been teasing for a while that I'm going to do a true speed test between these 3 limbs, the Hoyt Velos, the Win&Win MXT-10 limbs, and the Uukha SX Plus limbs, to see which limbs are actually faster and give a lot of details and a lot of information and a lot of actual real data to you, the consumer, to see which ones are actually the fastest or the most efficient, depending on what you're looking for. So I've been wanting to do this for a very long time, to actually see what limbs are the fastest. You know, to see and put to the test the manufacturer's claims of, oh, we have the biggest, best, fastest, latest, greatest, whatever limbs, right? Because everybody always says that every single year. So I have a system that I'm going to be using to be testing these limbs to keep everything as fair as humanly possible. Now, how to actually compare speed tests to speed tests. It's very difficult, but I'm going to do it in a real world setting, settings that actually matter, and in a setting that is really applicable to everyday shooters. And I'm going to make sure to apply a lot of knowledge that I've learned over the years on what affects tune to be able to keep all those factors the same as much as possible, so we get a true comparison between the different limb types. You know, we've got 3 different manufacturers that have 3 different claims that all claim to be faster or smoother or the fastest. You know, that might be within their own product line, or that might be compared to any other archery equipment out there, and we have no idea what that type of stuff means. So the things that absolutely will affect the tune, I will be keeping the same. For sure the string will stay the same, because I've found that even 2 strings from the same manufacturer, the same builder, of the same material, don't tune the same. Even though they're the same spec, the same end string length, the same center serving length, the same everything, they just don't tune the same. They generally weigh slightly different, and that ultimately affects the actual tune of the bow itself. So I'm going to keep the string the same. I'm going to keep the plunger the same center shot, and the same plunger tension setting. I will adjust the bow weight up and down to compensate for the tune, not the plunger tension setting, because I have found at my level of shooting that the plunger tension setting is really important for a given setup. And I found that after I do my entire bow setup and tune, and then go through a walkback tune and do a bare shaft tune, and then fine tuning at distance, I almost always end up with basically the same plunger tension setting within half of a turn. So I'm going to use my standard plunger tension setting that I've learned over the years that is optimal and ideal for me as far as a high level performing shooter is concerned. And I'm not going to change the plunger tension setting. Now, the limb weights are slightly different. They are measured at slightly different lengths due to the different manufacturers. You know, I've got a Win&Win set and a Hoyt set and a Uukha set here, so they are going to be slightly different. These Uukha SX Plus limbs are marked 46 pounds, the Hoyt Velos are marked 42 pounds, and the MXT-10 limbs are marked 40 pounds. Now the MXT-10 limb is rated at a slightly shorter draw length, so you can say it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a 42 pound limb. So it's going to be real close as far as an apples to apples comparison goes, except you know, the Uukha SX Plus limbs are a little heavier in the actual draw weight setting, but we have adjustable limb bolts, and I'm going to be adjusting those to, you know, get the tune the same. I will also be keeping the finger tab the same. You know, the same tab face, the same tab backing, the same finger spacer, everything. Tab face thickness and how worn it is makes a huge difference in the tune and therefore the speed. I will be keeping the arrows the same exact arrow build. I will not change them at all from tune to tune or bow to bow. These are Easton X10s. They are 410 spine, and I will weigh them and get a grain weighting for them, because what I'm going to do is I have a draw force curve device set up here thanks to one of my patrons, and I'll be able to input data of arrow speed and arrow weight, and due to the ability of reading the draw force curve and how much stored kinetic energy is in the limb, we'll be able to see the efficiency of the limb as well, in addition to the raw actual speed that we're getting out of the bow. So the efficiency comes down to how much energy loss is due to a number of factors, including of the unloading of the draw weight into the arrow and how it hits the arrow and how it breaks the spine down. Harsher limbs that do it earlier in the draw cycle actually will lose efficiency, and different mass weight limbs will also transfer more or less energy and kinetic energy directly into the arrow, resulting in higher or lower efficiencies. So it's a relatively complex system, not necessarily, but it's definitely as real world as it could possibly get. So I'm not going to say things like these limb bolts are set in the medium setting, because that really means nothing. You know, every riser is different. Every person's definition of medium is different. And all I'm going to do is keep all the things that I can possibly keep the same that do affect tune, and then change only the bow weight up and down to compensate. I'm also going to be keeping the riser the same. This is a 25-inch Hoyt Exceed. I'll keep the stabilizer setup the same, because that again does affect tune as well. The grip's going to stay the same. Really, everything is staying the same. The only thing that's changing are the actual limbs and the limb weights, because I need to be able to adjust to get the bows to tune. Now, I could set all the limbs at a given draw weight and shoot them all with the same arrow and measure a speed through a chronograph and say, oh, these limbs are faster or these limbs are slower, but that doesn't take into account the arrow tune. If the arrow isn't tuned, there's no point to even measuring speed, and there's no point in even comparing speed, because if an arrow is untuned, what does an extra 10 feet per second get you? Nothing. It gets you nothing, because your arrows don't perform as well, you don't shoot as high as scores, so there's no point in even saying it's faster, because it's useless. So the only point of being able to find out if a bow or a limb or any sort of setup is faster or slower than another is to have your bow tuned, and tuned as best as you can possibly do it. So I'm always going to go for the same type of tune. My goal is to be very neutral at 30 meters with bare shaft tuning, because I find that that is the easiest way to replicate a tune from bow to bow, and then we'll be able to compare that. I have a chronograph I'll be shooting through. It'll take me several hours to get set up and tune each different setup and weigh the limbs and weigh the bows and then shoot them through a chronograph. And because the sun position in the sky will change throughout the day, I have a chronograph with lighted shields up at the top that reflects and sees the arrow pass through it. So it will eliminate that type of influence of the sun changing positions, and we won't have an issue there. So I'm really going to try to control as many factors as possible, because I want this to be as clean of a test as possible. Because I'm no longer sponsored, so I have no real reason to fudge any of these results, and I'm as excited as you are to see what we come up with here. So I'm going to start with these SX Plus limbs. I'm going to align them really quick. I've got a known straight stabilizer on here so I can set my limb alignment and then my center shot, and then I'm going to head outside and start tuning, and once I get a good solid tune, shoot the arrows through the chronograph and then go on to the next set. Alright, so the brace height that I will be using is 8 7/8 inches, which is equivalent to roughly 22.5 centimeters, give or take. The tiller setting that I will be using is not set yet. This is set at basically 0 tiller. I'm gonna run it between 1/8 and 1/4 positive, you know, meaning for Olympic style recurve. And I'll always make sure it's the same from setup to setup. Roughly between 1/8 and 3/16. So that's where I'm gonna set it every single time. I'm here at 30 meters. I've got an arrow stuck in the ground here to mark that for me, so I can't possibly screw that up. And I've got a camera down range, so you'll be able to see the impacts as I'm shooting it. And I'm going to tune the bow here at 30 meters using standard recurve tuning principles. But again, I'm only going to use the bow weight. I'm not going to change anything else. Everything else is staying the same. Well, that's a good tune. It's pretty good as far as I'm concerned. You know, they are slightly weak. If I were to put tape on the back of the arrows, I bet you they'd be perfect. 6 arrows, 3 fletch, 3 bare, basically all in the 10 ring on an 80 centimeter face here at 30 meters. More than acceptable, and I'll shoot for that for the other two. I'm gonna go up close now, and we'll shoot this through the chronograph, and then go get some data from it. All right, let's see what kind of speeds we get here with these SX Plus limbs. I'm gonna shoot 5 arrows and get the average speed of the 5 arrows. .209, 208, 208, 208, 208. So 4 of them 208, 1 of them 209. Now we're gonna head inside and do a draw force curve and see what kind of kinetic energy is stored into these. And then after we're done with the other 2 bows, I'm gonna input the data from my arrow weight as well as the speeds that the bow is shooting. So that way we'll be able to get some comparisons, one-to-one, apples to apples, see which bows are faster and more efficient. All right, so we're in here and we're gonna do our very first draw force curve. We're gonna do it for these SX Plus limbs. So here we go. Now everything is going to be measured in the AMO draw length, just so everything looks very, very similar and consistent. I'm going to do 3 of these each to make sure all my curves look similar and correct, because I don't want any errors and I want it to be as consistent and as clean as possible. We just did 3,063 data points. It looks like a super, super clean curve. It's as close as, it's as good as it could possibly look with just pure data points. Alright, so we're all done with the draw force curves for these SX Plus limbs. I am going to switch to the Velos next, the Hoyt Velos. Those are going to be the next limbs I shoot. Back here again at 30 meters. Let's see how fast I can tune this thing. Well, I'm really close on the tune. Really, I think just the knocking point a teeny bit off here. Kind of out of shooting shape. I haven't really shot much for the last month. Really at all, so it's a little rough. All right, so I think that's about as good as I'm gonna be able to get it. I almost have all 6 in the 10 ring down there as far as 3 fletch, 3 bare. It's close as I'm gonna get it. And you know, between being out of shooting shape and it being blisteringly hot out here, it's 94 degrees right now. I mean, at least that's hot for this time of year. It's good enough. So let's go shoot it through the chronograph. So a quick little update. I did have some issues because of the heat. As I mentioned just before this pause session here, I definitely struggled dealing with the heat. Not just me, but more importantly, the equipment. The chronograph actually was giving me some really bad errors, and I reshot the Hoyt Velos through the chronograph, and gonna jump to that clip now. We will also be doing the same thing for the Win&Win MXT-10 limbs. It was pretty brutal, and I believe it overheated the sensors in the actual chronograph. So things didn't work correctly. So this next little footage, you'll notice a different t-shirt, and you'll notice a different day. And then I'll jump back and forth between the 2 days for the 2 different things. So sorry about the little bit of error. It's all unforeseen stuff, and you know, just wanted to give you guys as clean of data as humanly possible. So this test is totally fair. And I'm doing this because I would hate to be unfair to any company. I like unbiased, data-driven results, and having data that's as clean as possible is extremely important to good results. So first I'm going to make sure my tiller is set correctly with the bottom limb bolt bottomed out, which it is, and then I will verify that my brace height is the same as I always run it. Alright, the tiller is exactly where I had it before, about a 32nd over an eighth. So the draw weight should be exactly where it was, and it looks to me right now that the brace height's really high. We gotta take some twists out. There we go, 8 7/8. So now this Hoyt set back up to where it was. So I'm gonna shoot 5 more arrows with these Velos set at the same draw weight that it was yesterday when it tuned. So we'll be able to see if there's a speed change here. I am the same distance from the chronograph still. I've added enough area to assume where the other camera would be and come back just to clear it like I was yesterday. 204. So definitely an increase there so far, but I'm going to shoot 5 arrows and we'll average it. 204. 203. 204. And 204. So let's do the math and find our average here. That's a 203.8 feet per second average, which is 2 feet per second faster than yesterday. So I'm really glad I did this because that's a big change and that will really affect the data as far as efficiency goes. I'm gonna go add that into the program that I'm using to compensate and make sure that all the numbers are consistent and accurate as we now have shot through the chronograph at ultimately the same ambient temperature and the same sun position in the sky with the infrared light bars on. So it's as consistent as we can possibly be with this level of chronograph. Okay, so we've got some good data on the draw force curve for these Velos limbs. Next up is the Win&Win MXT-10 Wood Limbs, and we're going to do the same process with those. Third and final set of limbs, the Win&Win MXT-10 Woods. Well, I don't even have to walk down there and I can tell that it's pretty close. Looks like all 6 may be in the 10 ring. They are all slightly on the stiff side by about as much as the Uukahs were on the weak side. Unfortunately, I am out of the range of adjustment on the limbs, on these limbs in this bow. So the limb bolts are fully bottomed out and I'm, you know, on trying to stay within my tiller, you know, that just over an 1/8 inch. Brace height's good. Plunger tension's the same, string is the same. I'm not changing anything, and unfortunately I can't get it any closer than this. It's really good. You know, I'd feel comfortable shooting this, although it's a little bit on the stiff side. So we may be leaving a teeny tiny little bit of speed out there. And you know, this is just part of that archery game. You know, you got to run with what you have, and this is what I have. 40-pound Win&Win limbs aren't quite enough for me for my 410s. 450s, they'd be perfect, but this is what I got to work with. So apparently my downrange camera got overheated by the sun and shut off. This is what I ended up with. As you can see, just slightly stiff. You know, the bear shafts are on the left side of the group, and the SX Plus was on the right side, so it's really close. But like I said, it's as close as I can get it because of the limitations of the limb weight. So I'm gonna shoot through the chronograph now. So after finally getting everything tuned and shot through a chronograph and all the draw force curves done, after doing all that, I kind of looked back and wanted to see if these numbers were correct, because it was so hot that the cameras that I was using, specifically the one that I was on the chronograph, was overheating because of the heat and the direct sunlight, and it would shut down. I also saw a couple of weird errors through the chronograph of like 10 to 20 feet per second off that were not normal, and I've never seen that happen. And the sun was directly overhead, so I don't know if it was overheating the sensors that pick up the arrow as it's going by or whatever. So I'm gonna shoot this Win&Win, the Win&Win MXT-10 limbs through the chronograph again, now that it is the same ambient temperature as yesterday when I shot the Uukha's, the SX Plus limbs through the chronograph, as well as the sun's relatively in the same position with the sensors of the chronograph in the shade. So I'm gonna shoot 5 arrows and call them out to you. So I just wanted to be super fair and be as clean as I could with what I have here. You know, if I had an indoor facility that I could shoot 30 meters and tune and then shoot through a chronograph, obviously that would have been, you know, better, but doing what I can. So 205, 204, 204, 205, 204. So it's about a half a foot per second. I think about 0.6 to 0.7 feet per second faster, divided by 5. That's 204.4, which is 0.8 feet per second faster than yesterday. All right, the last draw force curve of the speed test video. I'm all set up and ready to go. So before we go too much further, I really want to explain why shooting through the chronograph again was a necessary thing and how I decided that it was important. So I noticed when I was shooting the Velos, before I actually started rolling footage, was that the chronograph wasn't acting right. It was acting very strange and very funny, including my camera that was recording the actual, the actual chronograph. And I had to have it sit in the shade for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then brought it back out and shot it again, and I still saw slight variances. I think the heat was just overall too much for what was going on. The sun was directly overhead, and it was getting down inside the chronograph and affecting the sensors. And I think that's what threw the readings off. And that's why I thought to myself, I should probably retry the actual test. And Thomas, who set me up with this draw force curve system and the actual software to run it, suggested that there was an error due to his experience playing with equipment just like I do. So I was like, yeah, you're probably right. So I went and checked it again this morning, and like I said, we did see a change, a 2 foot per second change on these Velos, and only a partial of a foot per second for the MXT-10 limbs. That's because before shooting the MXT-10 limbs, I had the chronograph sitting in the shade the entire time while I was tuning and setting up the bow instead of in direct sunlight. So that was my error and my bad, and I have Thomas to thank for that to, keep me honest. So let's take an actual hard look at real data and compare these 3 sets of limbs together, not just at raw speed, but efficiency. And I'll explain to you what efficiency means to you and what it means to me. So you'll see the curves themselves are very different. At least the SX Plus limbs are very different than the Hoyt and the MXT-10 limbs. At least you'll see that the SX Plus limbs are very different than the Velos and MXT-10 limbs. You'll see that there's a lot more energy stored earlier in the curve than the other two due to the curve profile of these Uukha limbs. And you'll see down in the chart at the bottom, at the arrow foot per second, the velocity, you'll see that the SX Plus limbs definitely perform better than the other two limbs by about 4 feet per second. And a 4 feet per second gain is pretty big. It's huge, actually. You know, it's at 90 meters, that would make a huge difference in scores in my experience, because, you know, you really needed to be above 200 feet per second, and if you could be above 205 feet per second, you really had an advantage and you really shot higher scores at 90 meters, at least in my experience. That's why a lot of people shot much higher draw weight when we shot full FITAs, and now that we're shooting 70 meters only, I've not seen a huge speed increase affect accuracy or scores all that much. But nonetheless, a 4 foot per second change on an X10 is gigantic as far as I'm concerned. So I don't know how they're doing it, and I'm not sure how it's possible, but these SX Plus limbs are absolutely smoking fast. Now, it's really interesting if you look over in the efficiency column, the bow efficiency column, and that's rated in percentages, you'll see quite a big difference there too between the three sets of limbs. These MXT-10 limbs and the Velos limbs were at a much higher efficiency rating than the actual SX Plus limbs. And so I need to explain to you what efficiency is and why it's important. So because we're not talking about raw speed only, you know, we're talking about real world application of these speeds, meaning the arrow is tuned so the arrow flies well so you can still shoot high scores. And that is comparable when you're comparing setups to setups when they are tuned. If they are not tuned and it's only at the same draw weight and you're just measuring the speed against the arrow, there's gonna be a totally different correlation, but it's not specific. It's not real world, and it's not applicable to me and you, because we wouldn't shoot a bow that untuned with those type of setups. So if you look at efficiency and you look at how much energy is transferred into the arrow from the limbs, a higher efficiency means you're essentially doing less work to get that same speed out of the arrow, the same performance, the same tune out of the arrow, most importantly, right? Because yes, the SX Plus are faster, but the efficiency is so far less. That means you have to exert so much more energy within your system to draw the bow back, because we pull the bow back, and you're actually losing out on efficiency to gain that speed. So what that means is during a tournament, by the end of a tournament, the difference between the SX Plus limbs and the MXT-10 limbs is almost 4%. 4% is a huge, huge amount of energy differential by the end of the day of shooting, especially when you're competing. You add stresses of tournaments, you add cortisol, you add hormones, you add diet change, sleep cycle disturbance, travel, all of those stress factors, and you reduce your workload by 4%. That's the difference between first and fifth, and as far as I'm concerned. That's a huge, huge differential. There are companies that spend millions and millions of dollars on clothing for cyclists and runners to reduce drag by tenths of percentages of points. So 4%, they would do anything to have a 4% advantage over their opponents. Now, if you stretch that timeline much further, for example, for myself, when I was training full-time and shooting a whole lot of arrows in an entire Olympic cycle, that's over the period of 4 years, I shot on average about 1,650 arrows a week, which totals about 330,000 arrows over the course of 4 years if you shoot for 50 weeks a year. You know, you got to take a vacation every so often. So that equates to 330,000 arrows, and 4% more arrows, or 4% less energy expended relative when comparing the two different types of limbs, is in total over 13,000 arrows. That's a huge advantage to have an extra 13,000 arrows shot during that 4-year time period with the same amount of energy expelled. So that means that I can do less workload with the same amount of arrows shot and feel fresher, or shoot the same amount of workload, because that's ideally the goal, is to tax your system as much as possible without injuring yourself and flirting with that line. And you're able to shoot 13,000 arrows more. And that's an advantage as far as I'm concerned. That's a mental advantage, and that is an actual physiological advantage over your opponents. And I don't know, I'm excited about this kind of data, and it really kind of is interesting to me to see such a differential. And like I said, it's impressive to see the SX Plus limbs be so fast. 4 feet per second is nothing to shake a stick at. That is really, really impressive. But a 4% efficiency change is amazing. It's really amazing. You know, you're getting a 2% speed increase versus a 4% efficiency increase. You know, it depends on the style of shooting and the shooter you are, depends on how much shooting you're doing, depends on how much competing you're doing. You know, you can pick and choose that type of stuff. So if you look in the column that says draw length energy in joules, it's basically reading how much energy is stored in the bow from 0 pounds all the way up to whatever pounds of draw length that I have when the clicker clicks, which is 29.66 inches of AMO draw length. And you'll see that that curve and how high and tall that curve is and how soon it is tall depends on how much kinetic energy is actually stored in the limbs. So it's not how much peak kinetic energy you have, but how much kinetic energy throughout the draw cycle are the limbs storing. And you'll see that the SX Plus limbs, because the curve is steeper and there is more draw weight earlier in the curve, it stores a whole lot more kinetic energy. Now, how much of that kinetic energy gets transferred into arrow speed and arrow velocity is where the efficiency comes into play. You'll see that the kinetic energy of the arrow in that column varies slightly depending on the speeds because the arrow weights are always the same. So the arrow weight and the velocity of the arrow gives you the kinetic energy of the arrow. Now, when you compare the kinetic energy that you store in the draw cycle compared to the kinetic energy of the arrow and the arrow speed, you'll see that the efficiency goes up a lot when you start looking at these two sets of limbs, the Velos and the MXT-10 compared to the SX Plus limbs. Why that's important and different is pretty simple. So basically what is happening is due to the way that these limbs unload when they are starting to throw and impart kinetic energy into the arrow, transferring that into velocity forward, is affecting the dynamic performance of the arrow. So how hard the limbs unload and punch that arrow, and when it is pushing that arrow and how it is pushing that arrow throughout the draw cycle affects the dynamic spine of the arrow. So how the efficiency can change really depends on how that curve comes in, meaning how hard is the limb hitting or punching the arrow as it is being delivered and when is it punching those arrows. You know, the SX Plus limbs are very heavy through the middle of the cycle, and that's why you see a very big difference in bow weight at the lower end compared to the higher end. The bow weight is closer together. That means the SX Plus limbs are kind of softer towards the clicker zone, which has a very different feel to them, no doubt about that. I felt that in my reviews of all of these limbs and these setups. But the way that it hits the arrow is softer at the beginning, but then the differential between the other sets of limbs are very different, and that's when the arrow gets hit really, really hard and the spine starts to actually bend more. It dynamically acts weaker and it breaks down quicker. So that means it's dynamically acting weaker, so you'll have to reduce bow weight to compensate to keep the same tune. Yes, the SX Plus limbs tuned a little bit higher and got a little bit more speed, but because of the way that draw cycle works and how it punches the arrows changes the dynamic spine. So if it didn't hit so hard compared to the other limbs, you'd be able to shoot with less bow weight to have that same speed, or you could shoot more bow weight and have even more speed if it didn't break down that arrow spine so harshly. Again, I kept every single factor that I possibly can keep the same with the exception of the limbs. The only change is the limbs. This way I was not affecting the dynamic performance of the arrow through any factors of string weight or tab thickness or spring change, plunger tension, things like that. And I was really just letting the limbs work and comparing apples to apples when limbs are compared against each other to really see which limbs are faster. And then I can also show you why limb efficiency is important. You know, my old method of dividing feet per second per pound was only so close and so accurate because you're not taking into effect the kinetic energies of either systems of the arrow or the bow. And once you do and you add it all together, that's when you start to see a big difference and you really start to have some honest numbers that you can really truly apply to real world situations. With all that being said, I'm very excited and happy I was able to produce this content. It was really fun. It was a lot of work. It was a little hot yesterday, and honestly, I needed to wear this shirt yesterday because it absolutely was one of those days. And, you know, I have Thomas, a huge thank you to Thomas for setting me up with this system and creating his draw force curve, you know, device basically, and creating a system that is super automated for me that is directly accurate. And also I need to thank Tristan again for setting me up with that infrared sensor draw force curve system. The first device here that I've got, we're still working this out. We're narrowing the field of view for the infrared sensor and then correcting the distance sensor to a linear 1-to-1 of draw length basically. So I'll be able to use this too in the future. And we're probably going to work on making these either available at some way, some shape or form for people out there. You know, Arduino and stuff like that, it's all open source. Basically all the coding is, or whatever you call it. I don't know what the coding is for all that stuff, but we're going to play with some stuff and knock around some ideas, and maybe we'll be able to get these in some people's hands out there to play with at home. So I've got Tristan to thank, and I have a lot of my viewers to thank for, you know, encouraging me to do all this archery nerd geeky data driven stuff. I definitely have Ryan to thank for helping me out with this design here on this shirt. He did basically all the design on this one. If you're interested in checking out these shirts or any other apparel that I've got, there'll be links in the description below, plus I'll put a card at the top up there for you to check out too in case. And if you're interested in learning how I tune my bows, I've got a great manual for you to check out. It's called Tuning for Performance. Links in the description below. It's available on my website, jkaminski.com as well. And it takes you through step by step how to set up and tune your Olympic style recurve. And there's a lot of information in here with no fluff at all. That's just a great, easy resource to thumb through when you're really looking to tune and set up your bow, just like I do. I also have Win&Win and Hoyt to thank for sending me some equipment and hooking me up with some gear so I can do these type of tests and shoot their equipment and give my honest, unbiased feedback and reviews of the equipment. You know, I'm not sponsored anymore, and it's nice to be able to just try everything and come up with all sorts of different combos and have no repercussions for it. And also Ryan as well, because he allowed me to borrow his SX Plus limbs for way too long in order to run these type of tests. So if you're interested in becoming a Patreon member or supporting my channel in many different ways, there are tons of links in the description below, plus links on my website, jkaminski.com. And, you know, I genuinely can't thank the archery community enough for encouraging me to do this type of work. It's exciting, I love doing it, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it. And I hope you can appreciate some of the craziness and the ridiculous lengths that I'm willing to go through to give you real hard data at home and not have this unknown about what is and what isn't actually happening within the archery system. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, consider hitting the subscription button and the notification bell, as well as the like button. I would appreciate it. Also, please consider supporting my channel. If you head to my website, jkaminski.com, there'll be info and links on Patreon, apparel, books, and equipment sales, PayPal donate button, a P.O. box to send things to, and above all else, please share this video because there's no better advertising than word of mouth.